The micro sites seem to be, many of them, I should yield the balance of my time to my colleague David Westphal for that, because that's really his specialty, but the microsite business models seem to be holding in a lot of cases. But you're right, it's in the middle where we see the real difficulties in the financial model. And that's, unless it is based on an affinity of some kind, such as professional or newsletters are thriving. But I guess they're sort of in that long tail part. But unless you have something that's based on some pretty solid affinity, I mean, even TV Guide faltered. So yes, you're right. The middle is the part that may face the most difficulty now. Well, thank you very much, and I'll be around if there's more Q&A and more. It's interesting that at these breakfasts that Annenberg usually has burritos, because that means it's harder to throw the eggs.
Thanks so much, Adam. You know, I think we know there will be interesting discussion when we have things like writing for hits or seeking wisdom on Wikipedia, and now we probably have the most controversial of all, which is there a role for government in news and information? David Westphal is editor of the California Healthcare Foundation Center for Health Reporting at USC, and he, like Adam, is a senior fellow at the Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy. And there, with our colleague Jeffrey Cowan, who directs that center, they took a look at assessing government's role toward the news business throughout American history, and David's going to update us on that a little bit.
Good morning. A couple of weeks ago, a columnist for the Boston Globe, Jeff Jacoby, took on the question of government subsidies for the commercial press, and he wrote this: "How dangerous would it be for the news industry to accept government help in the form of subsidies, tax credits, or other financial support?" It's the premise behind what Jeff said there that I want to talk about this morning. The premise being that providing subsidies for the commercial press would be something new in American history. I talked about this a little bit a year ago here, and my colleague Jeff Cowan and I since have put some pretty hard numbers, I think, into the formula for how much government money has been flowing into the commercial press. And actually, this is something that I thought I had a pretty good fix on, but I was surprised at the outset to find out that the government is providing about 40% of public broadcasting's budget. But I was even more surprised to find out how much tax money goes to support the commercial news business, and that a good deal of this support is in the process of fading away. And there is, I think, a disconnect, a kind of mythology that gets in the way of a considered discussion about what should be the government's role now in the news revolution. Jeff Cowan and I came to believe in our research that it's important to get some fundamentals straight. The assertion commonly heard that it's wrong for the government to get into the news business has the context and history all wrong. So we begin with a simple fact, and that is that there has never been a time when American government wasn't supporting the commercial press. And I don't mean supporting it just a little. It was there even before the birth of our country, and it continues today, whatever the platitudes we might imagine about the separation of press and state. And this, we believe, has very important implications for the debate about whether new forms of government aid are a good idea or a bad idea. Our report focused on three kinds of support for news publishers: postal subsidies, paid public notices, and federal and state tax breaks. But I should note at the outset that in ways big and small, state, local, and federal governments have provided many other kinds of financial assistance for the news business. The big list might include things like free licenses for broadcast owners, ultimately worth billions of dollars, free or very low-priced access to city sidewalks for newspaper vendor boxes. The small list might include things like free use or heavily discounted use of an office at the police station or city hall for a newspaper reporter to work. Note that we are not saying here that American governments back the commercial news industry in the way some governments do, say Sweden, and its direct cash payments to newspapers. But neither is it true that American government assistance amounts to peanuts, or as many people believe, is non-existent. Beyond the $1 billion plus that government puts into public broadcasting every year is foregoing more than that in support of the commercial news business. So let's look at these three ways that the support plays out: postal subsidies, paid public notices, and tax breaks. I should mention that the first two have been around since before the Revolutionary War. Scholars have argued that it's precisely because of postal subsidies that newspapers were able to develop in the United States. Postmasters assigned very low rates to newspaper mailings in colonial days, and many allowed the free exchange through the mails between two newspapers. This laid the framework for high postal subsidies for newspapers and magazines, and they were no fluke. It was a policy championed by Washington and Madison. If you're going to have a rogues gallery of people who advocate subsidies for the news business, there they are. They're at the top of the list. And then it was codified in the Postal Act of 1792, one of the first acts of Congress. And it's a structure that would remain for more than 250 years. There's a similar story for paid public notices, also an idea incorporated from old Europe that over time was picked up by every level of government in the United States. As you know, public notices are required for many government activities like municipal zoning changes, school district budgets, bankruptcy notices, and the like. Governments impose these requirements on themselves, on subordinate governments, and on the private sector. And of course, the result for newspapers has been money in the bank. This business has been especially lucrative for community newspapers. Their National Trade Association, the National Newspaper Association, estimated in 2000, the year 2000, that it represented between 5 and 10% of all revenue for the community newspapers. And it's not just small newspapers that benefit. Virtually all newspapers get to play, including the Wall Street Journal. We conducted a one-month study last year of the Journal and found that in terms of column inches, it was government-mandated public notices that consumed the largest share of advertising space, not dollars, of course, but space in the paper. You can tell it's lucrative by the number of times newspapers get into court fights over who's entitled to one public notice contract or another. If you look at the cumulative effect of these two categories and add in federal and state tax breaks, here's what you see. By the late 1960s, postal subsidies were worth nearly $2 billion in today's dollars. Public notices at that time brought in, and still bring in, hundreds of millions in revenue. We're not aware that anyone has figured out exactly how much money is at stake here. In fact, this is, I think, a great candidate for additional research. But in Iowa, the Newspaper Association estimated it amounted to 1/20 of 1% of local government spending. Others have said the figure is more like 1/2 of 1%, but if you take even that lower figure, 1/20 of 1%, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, that's $800 million nationally. And that's just local jurisdictions. It doesn't include state and federal, nor the private sector that is required to put a variety of public notices in newspapers. So we're almost certain to be talking here nationally about revenue, annual revenue in 10 digits as well. And finally, state and federal tax breaks today are worth almost $1 billion in revenue loss to the government. They include everything from federal tax breaks on unsold magazine and circulation expenses to sales tax exemptions on the purchase of newsprint and ink. So if you've been able to add all this up in the late 1960s and converted it to today's dollars, you'd be talking about government assistance of one kind or another in the $4 billion range, again, just for these three categories. It's a small chunk of newspaper, news magazine revenue, but significant nevertheless. The second finding of our report is that this support is in the midst of long-term decline, and it's destined to continue unless government takes a different course. The story of decline is already mostly played out in postal subsidies. Prior to 1970, 75% of the cost of mailing newspapers and magazines was borne by the Postal Service. But beginning with the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970 and continuing today, that level of subsidy has been in almost constant decline. We calculated it had fallen to just 11% in the early 2000s, although the Postal Service says the current number is somewhat higher than that. In any case, it's been a massive decline, and given the fact that Postal Service estimates a budget deficit this year of $7 billion, we're not likely to see a reversal. This dynamic of decline is at play as well in public notices, which are very likely to go the way of postal subsidies. Legislation has been introduced in 40 states to move public notices to the web. In some cases, they might go to government websites, in some cases to news industry websites. So far, most of these initiatives have failed, and public notices mostly remain in newspapers. And there are good reasons why right now they should, including the reality that they'll be seen by more people if they're published in printed form than if they're simply posted on a website. But the shift has begun, and we think it's inevitable it will grow. And it means the large majority, perhaps overwhelming majority, of this profitable business will go away. We think precipitous declines are not as likely for the various sales and income tax breaks that newspapers and news magazines in particular get now. But since many are based on the old and fading print model, they too are likely to decline. So all this raises a question: is this what the government wants to do? To reduce funding for legacy news businesses right now? These declines have not been happening because, in the main anyway, because anyone's got it out for the news industry. They've resulted from government spending concerns or technology changes. So, shouldn't new forms of government assistance be considered at this critical moment for the news industry? In this report, we don't make specific recommendations about policy initiatives, although you all know that there are many, many of them out there. Things like a WPA type program for employing writers and editors, tax law changes that would allow newspapers to become nonprofits, and so on. And there are many more. You can find a good sampling of them on the website that encompasses this report, which I'll speak about in a second. We do offer a couple of additional thoughts, though, based on the research of where higher government assistance might go. One, public broadcasting, and there are two kind of interesting data points here. One, among news media, public broadcasting has by far the highest levels of trust among American citizens, which is interesting, right? Because one of the central arguments of the fact that we can't have subsidies for the press is that Americans won't trust a news organization that gets money from the government. It turns out they do. The second data point is compared to international norms, public broadcasting in the US is significantly underfunded. On a per capita basis, Great Britain spends 60 times more than the United States does on public broadcasting. So if our news environment needs significant strengthening, a pretty obvious remedy is at hand in public broadcasting. And the final, the second point, that we referred to in this report is that it may be time to change the laws that prohibit domestic dissemination of news broadcast by the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and other international broadcasting services of the United States. A 1949 law prohibits these newscasts from being rebroadcast to a domestic audience, but of course the internet is in the process of making this prohibition a meaningless relic, and taking the law off the books would allow there to be a much more aggressive use of this valuable journalistic resource. In our report, we also offer a modest framework for considering government aid to the news business. You can see that and more about this topic at fundingthenews.org is the website. Ultimately, we hope this report helps put to rest a myth about the relationship between the news business and government. It just isn't true that the commercial press has been walled off from government assistance in some sort of church-state separation. We do believe that we do not believe that new government assistance is therefore the only logical result. But we do suggest that financial support would be perfectly in sync with American history. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Wouldn't you first have to convince the press that a news agency that's overtly supported by the government is truly a free press? You have to convince the press first, right?
Well, and yes, that's true. I have wondered, you know, I had been in newspapers for most of 4 decades, and I've thought back about the opportunities that I had as a journalist, as an editor, to do a better job than I did of informing the public about the things that I just talked about. Isn't this right? I don't think the press has been particularly aggressive about pointing out when they argue editorially for continuation of paid public notices when the legislature is trying to cut them off, that there's a significant revenue benefit for newspapers to continue this. I don't think that's been much. Those things have not been much part of the conversation, and so I think there are many reasons why there's an assumption that to provide government assistance to the press would be a break in American history, and I would suggest that those of us who have been reporters and editors have probably been part of that reason. Yes.
In countries that do directly subsidize news organizations, what's an example or two of a mechanism for that? Do they directly pay the news organizations? Is there a foundation that distributes the money, some intermediary, or how does that work?
Well, there are a lot of different examples. Sweden actually has a formula. Each newspaper gets X amount of money from the government. Who was it? Sarkozy recently, a couple of years ago, I guess, decided that when a French young person reaches age 18, they get a free subscription to the newspaper. So I mean, there are a lot of different ways the government, and a lot of ways our government does it too, but a lot of ways that you can have, you know, sort of very direct payments or more indirect subsidies. There have been some studies too. I think it was Sweden where the introduction or perhaps the acceleration of subsidies occurred, and a research paper found that after that happened, there was more critical examination of the government than before. And again, I think the public broadcasting, the American trust in public broadcasting is pretty good exhibit A for demolishing the notion that you can't subsidize the press and have the American people and expect the American people to trust it. I mean, it's not even close, the trust level of American newspapers on the one hand and public broadcasting. Yes?
As you looked at possible ways that the government might move into other avenues for support, did you find anything useful in the communist models in which they would have monopolies on the newsprint and make allocations of newsprint to ensure the publications would have what they called a fair pricing of newsprint, the running of circulation through the postal system to provide for delivery, or other communist type models?
Felix, I got to admit, we didn't spend a lot of time looking at the communist model. And I should say that the framework that we suggest is very quick and modest. I mean, the first point is do no harm. That a tremendous cycle of innovation is underway, obviously, as we've heard this morning, as we all know, and that there are dangers there for the government to intervene. The second one is to focus on innovation, as the government has been very successful in the past at especially technological innovation. Think where the news business would be without satellites, for example, or you might say the internet. So we have a kind of a cautious framework for thinking about government taking new steps to subsidize the press.
What about partisan news, like has the Obama's government diminished support for Fox News, for example? Fox News, you know, partisan news, politics, Democratic versus Republican, and the Fox News is very Republican. Has the government, a Democratic government, diminished the support for those kind of news or newspapers? Have you found anything about it? You know, how politics play a role in government support for news?
In the United States? Or?
Yes, in the United States.
Well, obviously, I mean, what we're talking about here is a tremendous flashpoint, and we don't either suggest that government support here would be a good idea or easily done, either one. And as NPR discovered and public broadcasting discovered a few years ago, it's very easy for government assistance to become a political problem for the recipient. And steps were taken at public broadcasting to create a new public funding formula that kind of got around the problem of Congress putting money directly into the national newscasts. But so it's not, you know, I don't know in terms of the, you know, Democrats versus Republicans over the years in terms of, you know, all of the ins and outs of that. But I would say obviously it's very easy for this to become a partisan issue.
We've heard a lot this morning about the way in which the news business is being institutionally transformed, and vast numbers of people are taking part in the news business as creators of content. Now, could you talk a little bit about how these various forms of public subsidy might reach that huge emerging news business rather than simply subsidize existing legacy organizations?
Well, I think there are a lot of indirect ways. I mean, since I've become an academic, I've become a fan of the government supporting research. But seriously, actually, I think, I mean, you all know, I mean, what an amazing time to be a scholar looking at what's going on in news and information and worldwide, but in this country. I mean, I think there are lots of ways that the government could play a helpful role in terms of understanding what's going on, in terms of helping the specific diaspora of small organizations. I mean, I think that there are, you know, probably a variety of kind of indirect innovation ways that could be thought of. This doesn't have to be cash going into the front door of any news organization. whether big or small. I think that there are, but I think something as basic as just fundamental research about what's happening to micro news sites would be something that would, government could think about investing in.
So let's have one more question for David, and then see if Ted Huffy's our as well.
I have a question about a key concept here. This is a very interesting discussion. I'm from the University of Stockholm, and my colleague as well is here from Sweden. We don't have government-funded media. We have state-supported media, and I'm interested here that there seems to be no distinction between money that comes from the state and money that comes from the government. So the Swedish government, under no circumstances, would give financing to a media organization, but the state does. So it's not at all connected to anything partisan. And it doesn't go to all the newspapers, as I've understood it. It goes, the newspaper that's doing best in a town does not get that subsidy, so it's to keep competition alive. But this is under threat now because of technological change.
Sure, of course, yeah, right.
And EU, yes.
When you say state, state but not government, I'm not sure what the...
It would be more the parliament. It has nothing to do with which government is actually in office. Now we have a non-social or a center-right government. Wouldn't matter if it's social democrat. It's more institutional than political.
Right.
So we have reached the kind of formal end of our program, but I know that these three would be happy to answer additional questions if you'd like, or you could come up and speak afterward. Why don't we take just a couple at least? Yeah.
So there's been some allusions, not illusions, to a nonprofit business model for news organizations. Could you each speak a little more about whether that, how that might affect the news landscape or the journalism landscape?
You want to talk about nonprofit business models?
I did a paper a while back on foundation-funded news, and now I'm part of one. An operation affiliated with a university. Actually, it's kind of represents two trends. University-affiliated news organization that's producing news, funded by a foundation. And I think that we are likely to see this continue to grow. Many foundations, I think, for example, and others, are finding that journalism is a pretty good way to get a message out about what's happening, and in situations where there seems to be a void or a shrinking pool of mainstream journalists, it's an opportunity to do good, to advance the cause in their way. So I think it will continue, whether it's sort of a bridge to the future, whether for example, community organizations, civic organizations across the country will begin to invest in news the way they invest in the arts and science and so on. I don't know, but I think we're probably headed for a continued period of nonprofit side, funded by a variety of sources. Could be a membership model and so on.
Having run a nonprofit news organization, NPR, both before and after the business plan, meaning before when it was getting direct cash, like it was a wire transfer, I guess, from the government, and then after to the business plan when, which is still in effect, where NPR in effect sells its news to the hundreds of local stations, which in turn get checks from the government. I think that that experience with nonprofit news and government support has a couple of lessons. One is that under the prior plan, I did get a call shortly after I became VP of News from a member of Congress who was on the committee that approved NPR's budget. And I told him that with all due respect, sir, the story which you're hoping that we do not report tonight, with this phone call, you've guaranteed that it's going to be on All Things Considered. That was the last call I received. So there's always that. You just have to stand up to it. But then after the business plan went into effect, we saw an interesting dynamic, which was that the stations actually liked news more than we expected. And so even though NPR is nonprofit, NPR News actually made money. And that money went into jazz, cultural programs, Let Us Buy Car Talk. So you're going to find in a nonprofit organization, there are some areas that might actually be, well, I guess we can't call it profitable. We'll have earnings.
One of the advantages internet sites have is its relatively low costs. We appear to be moving away from net neutrality, where there's going to be differential charges. What would that do to all of these areas, do you think, if we move away from net neutrality?
Well, I guess this is a good week to talk about that with the reports of the Google Verizon talks. I suppose it's not clear how it'll play out in terms of costs to consumers. It'll certainly play out in terms of costs to information providers. That if, as we understand the talks, which may or may not, Google is now violently denying that this is going on. If we understand what they've been discussing, it's that Verizon and others would give preference to certain types of content over others. So while our bill for internet service may or may not change, the mix of what we see when we go online would change. If I can give an example from another part of the world, there is a bit of competition, and you can see this actually play out in the United States if this moves in this direction. There's competition in some parts of the world, in Africa and Asia, between the mobile telephone company and the bank. Now, why is there competition there? Because in much of the world, there's a tremendous amount, and even in some areas, a dominant amount of what we call banking done over mobile phones. You make your payments, you send money to your relatives, whatever. The phone companies have now suddenly realized, well, wait a minute, why should we let ABSA Bank do that? We can collect that money, and we can make the money that the banks are making. So the phone companies are saying, okay, we'll give preference to our remittance system and keep the bank's systems over here. So you can see that start to play out, not just in information, but in terms of, well, gee, if Amazon doesn't pay Verizon for preferential service, does that mean that when I want to buy a book, that Barnes & Noble will come up and I have to really work to find Amazon? There are all kinds of ways this can play out.
There's a theme, I think, that's run through, at least for me, all of these discussions today, either explicitly or implicitly, which is sort of the who watches the watchers problem, or maybe even a who watches the people watching the watchers, or something like that. You can create a crowdsourced site that tries to assess the credibility of facts on Sunday talk shows, but then are people going to trust what that site is saying? Do you then create a site to watch that site? You can create or expand upon a system for government funding of the media, but how do we know how those decisions are being made? Do you need to create an organization to assess that, and then who's going to trust that organization, and so on and so forth? And maybe I spend too much time on my blog and other blogs arguing with rigid ideologues on both sides, but I feel fairly hopeless about this problem, because it seems like no matter what, there's a trust gap, and we've come so far as a society, it seems to me, from the time when you could say about, for example, Walter Cronkite. If you've lost Walter Cronkite, you've lost the country. There isn't any figure or organization, I don't think, that fills that role, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. But my question is, to what extent do you, and if anyone has any thoughts on this, to what extent is that problem, that trust gap, something that can actually be addressed by either technological or changes or organizational changes, and to what extent is it just a change in the way that we as a society think about news, about knowledge, about truth, what is true and what is not, and is just sort of something that the genie's out of the bottle and it can't go back. Because that's kind of how I feel, and I don't like feeling that about it, but I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that.
But I think that's one reason why at least for the project that I'm launching here, is I think you need a system that provides a lot of space to experiment and a playground. And I think that's where, if you have a place where you have APIs, you have a free content license, it's a software platform that encourages folks to come in and experiment, fail, try again. It's really important. And I kind of point back to the 10 years of Wikipedia. I mean, if you said in 2000 that you would have an online persistent store of knowledge, that within 15 seconds of the Super Bowl being won, the score was in there, the MVP was in there, and the key plays are all documented already. Within 15 seconds of the game ending, it would all be there, and we expect that today. I mean, I would say you're crazy in 2000, but here we have it now, and you expect Wikipedia to be updated that quickly. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about it in that I've seen Wikipedia grow up from really just being a scratch pad back in 2003 with no real strong developer community, without a lot of experimentation going on, to become this really amazing resource and an amazing developer community around it. And I hope that that tradition continues. But I do see this as a critical point, because you do see Wikipedia getting more full. The folks who build up that experience of working together online to create these things are kind of moving to other areas. OpenStreetMap is a great example of something that has worked, but I'm not sure the software platforms are there to allow for this experimentation. But I think open content helps a lot. And I think any project that does something like this has to be open, so you can take the data that's been gathered by the crowd and it can find life in other meta projects, exactly as you described, people watching the watchers and watching those watchers.
We're going to have a final comment from David, and then I'm sorry we're going to have to cut it off on scene 11.
Just a very quick addition to that. I think, we're obviously on a road to someplace I think is better. But when you think about compared to what? I mean, we were in a situation where a community basically had one voice, unchecked voice, that was fortress-like often, that wouldn't own up often. And so we are now in a process of moving to a tremendously more transparent information culture, in which not only the new media, but now the old media too, are finding they must be transparent. And that's a march to the truth that I think will continue.
Before I ask you to join me in thanking these colleagues, I want to just selfishly say what a pleasure it is for me to work with people like this. I wish we also could have heard from Laura Castaneda, who is our new assistant director, on her remarkable research on distance learning, from Jerry Swirling, who does this fabulous gap report that looks at the generally accepted practices of public relations and always comes up with fascinating findings, to Felix, whose work on the history of Latino newspapers in this country is just a rich feast, which he's putting together so beautifully. I wish we could hear from Vicki about her remarkable leadership conference and your entrepreneurial boot camp. And Kirsten, whose wonderful research will be joining us. I love your thoughts, for one thing, about what young people are feeling about the media and the kinds of different relationships they have. And Joe Saltzman on the image of the journalist in popular culture, which is just a great resource online now. And that's just the folks who are here. I feel very, very lucky, and I hope you'll join me in thanking these three.